The land stretched endlessly beneath the wide, burning sky, its silence broken only by the restless sigh of the wind brushing across the prairie grass and the creak of the weathered windmill turning above the well. Thomas Hale sat on the worn porch of his cabin, his boots propped against the rail, staring out at the world he had built and yet did not truly live in. Years had passed since he last heard the laughter of another voice close by. Years since the warmth of his wife's hand or the sound of his son's footsteps echoed across the wooden planks of the porch. Their graves lay not far off, beneath the shade of the old cottonwood by the river, two simple markers in the soil that carried more weight than any words could describe. Solitude had been his companion since then, both punishment and shield, and the days rolled on like dust in the wind, a quiet, predictable, and endlessly empty. Every morning he rose before the sun, tending to the cattle that grazed in the low pastures, patching fences that never seemed to hold, and hauling water from the well. His meals were plain and sparse, beans and cornbread, sometimes venison if he bothered to hunt. He spoke only to himself, muttering curses at stubborn animals or weather that refused to favor him. When traders passed through every few months, he bought what little he needed with as few words as possible, never inviting them to linger. His world was small by choice, a cage built not of walls but of silence. That evening, as the sky turned molten with the fading sun, Thomas leaned back on his chair and let his eyes drift toward the ridgeline to the west. It was a habit, scanning the horizon for signs of trouble or of life. The mesas rose like dark teeth against the blood-orange sky, and for a long moment, nothing moved. Then he saw tame shadows against the ridge, faint at first, then clearer as they descended in a line. 10 riders, their figures straight and proud despite the distance, their ponies stepping with the deliberate grace of people who knew the land. He felt his stomach tighten, his hand twitching toward the rifle leaning against the wall by the door. As the riders drew nearer, the details sharpened. Dark braids caught the last light of the sun, bows and rifles slung across their backs, the faint shimmer of beadwork catching on their clothing. Apache. There was no mistaking it. His breath slowed, heavy with a mix of caution and the instinct to defend what was his. Memories flickered in his mind, stories he had heard of raids, of cattle driven off, of ranches burned. Fear mixed with something else, something he couldn't quite name. As he rose to his feet and lifted the rifle into his hands, the riders came on in silence, the only sound the crunch of hooves on the dry earth and the soft jingle of tack. Their faces were unreadable at a distance, but even as they closed in, Thomas saw no wild charge, no war cries, no weapons raised. They rode with the weariness of men who had traveled long and hard, their posture still proud but their horses gaunt. 10 of them, each one watching him as if weighing his soul with their eyes, until finally the lead rider raised a hand and brought the group to a slow halt just beyond his fence line. Thomas stood rigid on the porch, the rifle heavy in his hands though he had not yet lifted it to his shoulder. His heart hammered against his ribs, not from the threat of violence, but from the sudden intrusion upon the fortress of silence he had built around himself all these years. The land had always been his alone, its emptiness both comfort and curse, and now before him stood 10 strangers who carried the weight of a world far beyond his own. In that still moment, with the last light of the sun dying across the plains, he knew something had shifted. Whether for good or ill, he could not yet say, but his solitude was no longer unbroken. The riders sat their horses in silence for a long moment, the dusk painting their faces in bronze and shadow. The eldest among them nudged his mount forward, his eyes never leaving Thomas. He was a tall man with lines etched deep into his face, each crease a story of years lived under the sun, years that mirrored the hardness Thomas knew in himself. The man stopped a few paces from the fence and raised his open hand, palm outward, a gesture Thomas recognized as peace. Thomas's finger rested against the trigger of his rifle. Though he did not lift it, he could feel the weight of 10 pairs of eyes studying him, measuring whether he was a man to be feared or a man to be trusted. The elder spoke, his words a mixture of Apache and halting English. The sound was heavy, rough, but the meaning pressed through. They needed shelter. They had ridden far, their supplies gone, their horses worn to the bone. Thomas glanced past him to the rest of the riders. They were not the fierce raiding party his imagination had conjured, but men and boys worn thin from travel. Their faces carried exhaustion more than menace, and their shoulders sagged beneath the weight of hunger. One rider's cheek was marked with a fresh bandage, and another looked scarcely more than 15, his eyes wide with both fear and hope. Thomas's grip on the rifle tightened, then loosened. His mind turned to the warnings he had heard from neighbors and traders over the years. Never trust an Apache. They'll slit your throat while you sleep. They'll burn your barns and scatter your cattle. Yet standing there on his porch, watching them breathe heavy from their journey, he did not see the fire of raiders. He saw human beings caught between desperation and pride, too proud to beg, yet too wary to turn away. The silence stretched like a taut ropes between them. Thomas's heart drummed a slow, heavy beat as he weighed his choice. He could order them off his land, risk angering them, risk turning desperation into violence, or he could lower his rifle and take a step no man in his position would think wise. His eyes flicked toward the barn, its roof patched a dozen times, its hay stacked high from the last harvest. It was big enough to hold their horses, dry enough to give them a night's rest. He slowly lowered the rifle barrel toward the ground. The elder's eyes followed the motion, dark and steady. Thomas lifted his chin and pointed with the barrel toward the barn. The elder nodded once, then spoke a quiet word to his men. One by one, they dismounted, leading their tired horses toward the barn doors. The scrap of hooves on dirt and the groan of the hinges seemed loud in the gathering quiet. Thomas stood stiffly, watching them pass. None of the riders moved toward him. None tested his patience. They kept their eyes low, respectful, though he could feel the tension in their bodies, as if they were ready to spring should his rifle rise again. He did not move, did not speak, until the last horse disappeared into the barn. The eldest lingered by the gate, offering a slight nod that carried more meaning than words. It was a nod of respect, of acknowledgement that Thomas had made a choice that could have gone either way. Inside his chest, a strange mix of feelings twisted: relief, fear, and something softer, something he hadn't felt in a long time. For years, his ranch had been silent, a fortress of loneliness. Now, with 10 strangers bedding down in his barn, the silence had been broken. He told himself it was only for the night, that come morning they would be gone. Yet even as he returned the rifle to its place by the door and stepped inside his cabin, he knew deep down that something had shifted forever. That night the ranch looked different, as though the land itself had shifted with the presence of others. Thomas built a fire in the pit outside, the flames licking upward, throwing sparks into the night. He had not cooked for more than himself in years, and the task felt strangely heavy as he pulled food from his larder. A pot of beans bubbled slowly, the scent of salt pork rising with the smoke. He laid out cornbread, hard but edible, and strips of venison he had dried earlier in the summer. The Apaches gathered around the fire in a loose circle, their bodies taut with caution, their eyes never wandering too far from their host. For a moment, Thomas felt like an intruder on his own land, a guest at his own fire. The men ate with quiet dignity. They did not lunge at the food, though hunger clearly weighed on them. They passed the bread in silence, shared the beans without waste, and nodded their thanks with small, deliberate gestures. Thomas sat among them, his own plate on his knees, chewing slowly as he studied their faces in the firelight. There were scars on some, weather and age on others, and in the younger ones a sharpness of gaze that came from seeing too much too early. He wondered what it was they had left behind, what kind of trail had brought them here. When the food had been eaten and the fire settled into a softer glow, one of the younger men reached into a pouch at his side. He drew out a small figure carved from wood, a horse with flowing lines cut carefully into its form. The boy, no older than 16, turned it in his hands once before extending it toward Thomas. For a long moment Thomas only stared at it, confused by the gesture. Then he reached out, his calloused hand closing around the smooth wood. It was warm from the boy's palm, simple yet alive with detail. He looked up and saw the boy's eyes fixed on him, not with suspicion but with a quiet offering of connection. Thomas felt his throat tighten as he gave a slow nod of thanks, a nod that carried more weight than the words he could not seem to find. The elder spoke again, piecing together broken English and gestures. His hands drew shapes in the air, his words rough but clear enough to paint a story. Soldiers had come to their land, burning homes, scattering families. They had fought, but the fight had cost them dearly. Some had fled north, some east. These 10 had come west, searching for a place to rest, perhaps even to begin again. Thomas listened without speaking, his mind tracing the lines of grief in their story. Loss was a language he knew well. He did not need perfect words to understand the weight of it. The firelight softened the lines on their faces, and the night carried a strange kind of stillness, not the hollow stillness of loneliness, but one filled with the quiet breathing of others. The subtle shift of bodies gathered close. Thomas leaned back against the porch post, the wooden horse still in his hand, and for the first time in years he did not feel the need to fill the silence with his own voice. He simply listened to the crackle of flames, the murmur of Apache words, the sigh of wind moving across the grass. A memory surfaced unbidden, of nights long ago when his wife would hum softly as their boy drifted to sleep by the fire. The ache of it struck him hard, but it mingled now with something unexpected, the faint warmth of belonging, the fragile thread of human company stitching into the fabric of his life once more. He had thought himself beyond such things, sealed off behind grief and solitude. Yet here, with strangers who carried their own wounds, he felt the walls inside him begin to loosen. For years he had eaten in silence, but tonight he had shared the meal. For years he had guarded his heart, but tonight a carved wooden horse sat in his hand, a reminder that even strangers could reach across the emptiness and offer something human. The days that followed slipped into a rhythm that Thomas had not known in years, a rhythm no longer defined by the sound of his own boots alone. The ranch, once a place where silence pressed against the walls like an unwelcome guest, now echoed with the voices of men at work, the sharp calls of laughter, and the steady beat of horses' hooves across the pasture. The Apaches had not left the next morning as he had expected. Instead, they stayed, and slowly, without spoken agreement, their presence wove itself into the fabric of his land. At dawn, Thomas would rise to find them already moving, 2 men patching the sagging section of fence by the northern field, another leading a string of horses down to the river for water. The younger ones chased stray calves, their shouts carrying across the open space, startling the cattle into motion before guiding them neatly back into line. Work that had once felt endless for one man now moved with a swiftness that surprised him. The fences that had taken him days to repair were fixed before noon. The barn roof, patched so many times it resembled a quilt, was mended in a single afternoon by careful hands that knew the balance of wood and rope. In return, Thomas shared what he knew. He showed them how to twist wire tight with the leverage of a fence post, how to stack hay so that it stayed dry through sudden rains, how to mend tack with the scraps of leather he always kept at hand. They watched closely, asking little but learning much. Pride flickered in their eyes when the job was done, not from his approval but from the satisfaction of labor well met. Evenings brought a kind of life he had not felt since his family's laughter once filled the porch. Around the fire, stories rose in a tongue he only half understood, their cadence carrying humor and sorrow alike. Sometimes they sang, low and steady, voices blending with the whisper of the wind. Thomas listened in silence, the music stirring something in him that he could not name. He never joined in, but he sat closer to the fire each night, his shoulders no longer weighed by the need to keep distance. One evening, after a long day of mending the eastern fence, he found himself watching the youngest boy ride across the field bareback, the carved wooden horse still sitting on the mantel inside his cabin. The boy leaned low, his hair streaming, the horse beneath him moving as though the two were one. A laugh, bright and unguarded, broke from the boy's lips, and Thomas felt his chest ache with a strange mixture of pain and joy. It reminded him of his own son, long gone, yet in the laughter of this stranger he found a memory that hurt less than before. Though the ranch felt alive again, Thomas knew the world beyond its fences was not so forgiving. Soldiers still patrolled the territories, settlers still carried fear and hatred for those they did not understand. He wondered what would happen if word spread that 10 Apaches had taken shelter on his land. Neighbors might turn against him, traders might stop coming, the law might come knocking. Yet when he looked at the men working beside him, When he saw the quiet dignity in their eyes, he found the fear fading. Solitude had once been his shield, but now it felt like a burden he no longer wanted. As the sun sank behind the mesas one evening, Thomas sat on the porch not alone but with two of the Apache men at his side. They spoke little, but the silence was no longer hollow. It was full, rich with the comfort of presence. He knew then that the ranch was no longer just his. It had become something greater, a place where loss and loneliness had given way to resilience and kinship. What began as a request for one night's shelter had become the birth of a family unlike any he had imagined. And for the first time in years, Thomas welcomed tomorrow not with dread, but with quiet hope.